The night sky above the outpost was heavy with silence, and Ethan stood near the edge of the metal platform, staring out into the darkness of the alien world and wondering if he was truly alone in this forgotten place, because every sound he heard seemed too sharp and every shadow seemed too deep. And it was then that he felt something watching him, and his skin grew cold as if a storm of eyes pressed against his back, and he slowly turned and saw Hirsch. She was not like anything he had seen before, because her skin shimmered faint silver like moonlight falling on water, and her eyes glowed with a strange soft blue, and her form was tall but fragile, almost like she had been shaped from glass, yet her presence carried a weight as if the stars themselves leaned closer to hear her breathe, and Ethan did not know whether to fear her or trust her, yet something inside his chest whispered that she had not come to harm him. For a long moment they simply stood, and the world held its breath, as though even the wind refused to move, and then she stepped forward, her voice trembling yet clear, and she said, "Human, tell me how to bond with you," and her words shook through him like a thunder in the veins, because never before had an alien spoken to him with such need, such desperate honesty, and Ethan felt his heart stumble. He asked her what she meant, but she shook her head and looked away, as if the words she carried were too heavy to explain. And when she spoke again, her voice broke like glass falling. She said, "I have watched your kind. I have seen you stay beside each other when you are weak. I have seen you protect each other when you bleed, and I cannot understand it, because in my world weakness is death and compassion is shame. Yet something in me burns to know why you humans choose to live this way." Ethan felt the weight of her question settle deep inside him, and he realized this was not curiosity, it was hunger, it was need, it was survival. And he asked her name, and she said Lyra, though her voice shook when she spoke it, as if the sound of her own name carried pain. And Ethan asked why she wanted this bond so badly, and her eyes filled with a storm of silence, and she whispered, "Because if I do not bond with you, human, I will lose everything that I am, and everything that I might be, and I will be taken back to them, and I will be broken forever." Words fell heavy between them, and Ethan did not know what to say, because he had never imagined an alien would plead with him like this, and yet he saw in her eyes not the cold distance of another world, but the trembling of a heart that was terrified of being alone, and he felt a strange pull inside his chest, as if her loneliness echoed his own, and he remembered all the nights he had stood on this outpost staring into the dark, waiting for a voice to break the silence, and now that voice had come. Lyra moved closer, her steps uncertain, as though every piece of ground she touched could shatter, and when she stood before him she lifted her hand but stopped just short of touching him, and her voice cracked once more, and she said, "Tell me how to bond with you. Teach me before it is too late, because they will come for me, and when they do, I will not survive without this bond." And Ethan felt a shiver crawl down his spine, for he now understood she was not only desperate, she was hunted. He asked who would come, and she lowered her gaze as if the very thought of speaking their name would summon them from the shadows, and she said, "They are my own people, and they do not forgive betrayal, and they will see this hunger for your bond as betrayal, and they will take me back in chains, and they will silence me forever. But I do not care, I cannot return to them empty. I cannot live without knowing what it means to be bound to a human, and so I beg you, Ethan, show me." The air grew heavy, and Ethan knew he was standing at the edge of something far greater than himself, and he looked at her and saw not only an alien but a being trembling between two worlds, one world that rejected her and one she did not understand yet longed for, and in that moment he realized the choice was already upon him. He could turn away and remain safe, or he could step forward and open himself to something unknown, something dangerous, yet perhaps something that could change them both forever. Lyra's voice softened almost to a whisper, and yet it carried through the silence with the strength of a cry for life, and she said, "Human, tell me how to bond with you, or I will lose everything." And as her words sank into his heart, Ethan knew this was not the end of their meeting. It was only the beginning, and the shadows that pressed around them promised that whatever was coming would not let them go without a fight. The outpost lights flickered as the wind from the alien desert howled across the metal walls, and Ethan stood inside the control room, staring at Lyra, who seemed so out of place with her shimmering skin and eyes that glowed faint blue in the dark, and he wondered what strange path had brought her here, and why fate had chosen him to be the one she begged for a bond, because her words still echoed in his mind like fire that would not burn out. And he could not push them away, no matter how hard he tried. Lyra walked slowly across the room, her movements careful as though every step carried weight from another world, and she spoke in a voice that trembled with both fear and defiance, and she said, "Ethan, you do not understand. My people are warriors. They are raised to fight from the day they can stand. They are told to destroy weakness and crush mercy, and never once show compassion, and to them a bond is not built on trust or love, but on dominance and control, and that is why I am here, because I do not want to live like them anymore. I want to know why humans choose another way." Ethan felt her words sink deep, because he too had grown up in a world where war had marked history. Yet humans had always found ways to survive together, not by tearing each other apart, but by standing side by side, and he looked at her and said, "Lyra, what you ask is not simple, because bonding with a human is not about chains or power. It is about standing with someone even when it hurts, even when you are afraid, and sometimes even when you are ready to give up. But you stay because that is what it means." She tilted her head as if trying to make sense of something impossible, and she said, "But why would anyone stay with weakness? Why would anyone choose to carry pain that is not their own?" And Ethan saw the tears in her strange glowing eyes and realized she had never been allowed to ask such a question before, because her people would have crushed it before it left her mouth, and he felt something tighten in his chest as he understood her struggle. The silence between them stretched until the outpost alarm blinked once red, then faded, and Ethan knew the system had detected movement beyond the perimeter, and he turned quickly, and his heart grew heavy because he realized her pursuers were already searching, and they might be close. And Lyra must have seen the fear in his eyes, because she stepped closer and whispered, "They will find me soon, and when they do, they will call me traitor, and they will call you fragile, and they will try to tear us both apart." Ethan gritted his teeth and said, "Then let them come," but as he spoke he felt the doubt rise in his heart, because he knew the outpost was not built for defense, and he was only one man, and she was only one girl from a race of warriors, and he wondered how long they could hold against a storm if it truly came. Yet he could not show her his fear, because she had come here for strength, not weakness. Lyra turned away and pressed her hand against the cold wall, and her shoulders shook, though no sound came from her lips, and Ethan walked closer and placed his hand gently over hers, and for a moment her glow brightened, as though the bond she longed for had sparked, but then it faded, and she whispered, "I do not know how to understand you, human, because when you fight, it is not for yourself alone, it is for each other, and when you bleed, you do not hide it, you share it, and when you fall, you rise together. And this is something I cannot explain to my heart, and yet I cannot stop wanting it." The words hit Ethan like an arrow, because he saw in her not just an alien, but a soul trapped between two worlds, one that demanded her loyalty, and another that offered her hope, and he felt the weight of her choice pressing down, and he knew that teaching her to bond with a human would not be about words, but about showing her through actions and sacrifice, and he asked her, "Lyra, are you ready to face what comes if you choose this path?" And she turned, and her eyes burned like blue fire, and she said, "I am afraid, but I will not run, because if I run, I will never learn, and I will never be free." Ethan nodded, and the alarm blinked again, brighter now, and the distant sound of metal grinding echoed through the valley, and he knew the hunters were near, and time was running short. And Lyra looked toward the sound, her body tense like a blade ready to break, and she whispered, "They will come for me soon, and when they do, you must decide if I am worth the risk." And Ethan looked at her and felt the answer rise from somewhere deep, and he said, "You came here because you saw something in us worth saving. So yes, you are worth it." The night grew darker as the storm of dust rose on the horizon, and Ethan knew it was not only the wind, it was the sign of ships coming closer, and his heart pounded with fear and determination, because he realized the struggle had only begun. And Lyra's voice broke the silence one last time as she said, "Human, I do not yet understand how to bond, but I promise I will try even if it breaks me," and her words burned into his heart like a vow he could never forget. The night pressed heavy on the outpost, and Ethan could feel the weight of silence around him, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, and Lyra stood close to him, her glowing eyes fixed on the horizon where shadows moved like ghosts, and every heartbeat felt like a drum that called the hunters nearer and nearer. Yet in the middle of that fear, there was something else between them, a strange warmth that Ethan could not explain, and it made him wonder if this was the beginning of the bond she so desperately wanted. Lyra spoke softly, her voice trembling yet determined, and she said, "Ethan, you told me that to bond with a human is to trust, and to feel and to stand even when fear is strong, but I do not know how to do this because all my life I have been told to hide fear, and to crush weakness, and to silence mercy, and now when I stand before you, I feel everything I was told to kill inside me, and it hurts like fire, and yet I cannot turn away from it, because my heart will not let me." Ethan looked at her and saw the pain behind her words, and he realized that she was breaking apart from within, because her people had raised her to fight, but something inside her had always longed for more, and he stepped closer and placed his hand gently over her trembling hand, and he said, "Lyra, you are already learning. You feel the fire inside, because you are no longer running from it, you are letting it live, and that is what humans do. We let ourselves feel even when it hurts, because only then do we know we are alive, and only then can we truly stand together." Her eyes glowed brighter as if a storm of light stirred within them, and she whispered, "But if I feel, then I will suffer, and if I suffer, then I will fall." And Ethan shook his head and said, "No, Lyra, if you suffer, you will rise stronger, and if you fall, someone will help you stand again. That is what it means to bond. It is not to carry the weight alone, but to share it, and to trust that someone will hold it with you." And she stared at him in silence, as though the words were carving new paths in her soul. The alarm flashed again, red and sharp, and the ground trembled slightly as if heavy engines were moving closer through the desert, and Ethan knew the hunters were almost here, and his chest grew tight, because he had no weapon strong enough to fight them. Yet he could not show weakness in front of Lyra. Not now, not when she was clinging to his strength, as if it was the only thread keeping her from breaking apart, and he forced himself to stand tall, even though fear burned in his stomach like fire. Lyra moved suddenly and stood before him, her eyes fierce and her voice low, and she said, "If they come for me, then I will fight, but if I fight the way they taught me, then I will only bring death, and if I try to fight the way you speak, then I do not know if I will be strong enough." And Ethan looked at her and felt the truth of her struggle, and he whispered, "Then fight not as they taught you, and not as you think we do, but fight as yourself, because you are no longer only theirs, and you are not yet fully ours, but you are something new, and that is stronger than either." She trembled at his words, as if a chain around her heart had cracked, and she asked him, "Ethan, why do you risk yourself for me when you do not know me, and when your people would call me enemy?" And he answered without hesitation, "Because you asked me for help, not as an enemy, but as someone lost, and someone desperate, and I could not turn away, because that is what makes us human. We see the pain in another, and we choose to stand even when it costs us, and that is what bonding means." Tears welled in her glowing eyes, and for a moment she looked less like a warrior and more like a child who had been denied love all her life, and she whispered, "I have never known someone to stand for me, never." And Ethan felt a pang in his chest, because he understood the depth of her loneliness, and he tightened his grip on her hand and said, "Then let this be the first time, and let it not be the last." And she closed her eyes and leaned her forehead gently against his, and the glow of her skin brightened as if the bond she longed for had taken its first breath. The peace lasted only a moment, because the sound of engines roared through the valley, and the walls of the outpost shook, and red light filled the room, and Ethan pushed her back gently and grabbed the emergency rifle, though he knew it was weak, and Lyra stepped beside him, her body glowing brighter, as if her very blood was turning to light, and she said, "If you fight, I will fight with you." And Ethan nodded because he knew they had no other choice. The first strike came as the outer wall shook, and the metal screamed under the pressure, and Lyra flinched but did not run, and Ethan raised the rifle, though his hands shook and he felt the weight of fear pressing on him. Yet when he glanced at her, he saw her standing tall and unbroken, and something inside him hardened, and he whispered, "Then let them come." And together they waited as shadows closed and the hunters did not enter yet. They circled the outpost like wolves, their voices echoing through the speakers sharp and cold, calling her traitor, and calling him fragile, and promising that both would fall. And Ethan felt rage burn through his fear, because he could not let them break her spirit, not after everything she had risked to come here. And he shouted back, his voice steady, that if they wanted her, they would have to face him and Lyra, and that neither of them would surrender. Her eyes widened at his defiance, and for the first time she smiled, though it was a fragile, trembling smile, and she whispered, "Now I begin to understand, because you stand even when you know you might fall, and you speak even when you know they will not listen, and that is what it means to bond." And Ethan felt her words strike deep like fire, and he realized that she was no longer only asking, she was beginning to believe. The hunters circled again, and the ground shook as if the storm itself had come alive. But inside the outpost, a new fire burned, because Ethan and Lyra stood not as enemies, not as strangers, but as something closer, something fragile and untested, yet unbreakable in its birth. And as the night pressed in, Ethan knew the struggle was only beginning, but the bond had already started to take root, and that bond would decide whether they lived or died. The outpost shook again as the hunters pressed closer, and Ethan stood with the rifle in his hands, knowing it was too weak against the machines outside, and Lyra stood beside him, her skin glowing brighter with every beat of her heart, as if her fear and her courage were fighting inside her at the same time. And Ethan felt the storm of danger closing in like a wall that would soon crush them, but he forced himself to remain steady, because he knew that if he showed fear, then Lyra would break, and everything she had fought for would be lost. Lyra turned her eyes toward him, and her voice trembled like a blade ready to shatter, and she said, "Ethan, they will tear through these walls soon, and when they do, you will fall, and I will be dragged back, and all of this will be for nothing. But if I return with you still alive, then maybe I can convince them that I was only curious and not broken, and you will be safe. But if I stay with you and fight, then both of us will fall, and I do not know if I am strong enough to carry such a choice." Ethan looked at her, and his heart burned, because he could see the truth of her words, yet he also saw the fire that had begun to live in her eyes, and he knew that sending her back would destroy her far more than death ever could. And he said, "Lyra, you came here because you wanted to know what it means to bond, and now you stand at the edge of that choice, and you must decide if the bond you want is worth the price you fear." And she shook her head, and tears like light fell down her cheeks. And she whispered, "I am afraid, but I do not want to return to them, because if I go back, then I will never be myself again, and I would rather die free than live in chains." Ground trembled harder, and the hunters' voices echoed again through the metal walls, calling her traitor, calling him fragile, and promising that the outpost would burn. And Ethan clenched his jaw and raised the rifle, though he knew it was almost useless, and he said, "Then let them burn the walls, if they must, because I will not give you up, and if this is the end, then I will face it with you." And his voice carried a strength he did not feel yet. When Lyra looked at him, she believed it, and that belief gave her courage. She stepped forward and placed her glowing hand on his chest and whispered, "Ethan, I understand now that to bond with you is not about being safe or strong. It is about standing even when you are afraid, and giving even when you bleed, and staying even when leaving would save you. And if that is the truth, then I choose to stay with you, even if it means I will fall, because I would rather fall with you than stand forever without. Knowing what this bond truly is, and Ethan felt her words burn into his heart like a vow carved in fire. The first breach came as the wall cracked open, and sparks rained down, and the hunters entered with armor darkened eyes, like burning steel, and their voices cut through the storm, saying, "She belongs to us, and you are nothing." And Ethan raised the rifle and fired, though the shots bounced harmlessly off their shields, yet he kept firing because he would not let them take her without. Standing, and Lyra stepped beside him, her body shining so bright it lit the broken walls, and she shouted back to them, "If you call him fragile, then you know nothing of strength, because strength is not in crushing others, it is in standing for them." Hunters roared and rushed forward, and Ethan felt himself thrown back as their strike tore across the room, and pain spread through his body, but he forced himself to rise even as blood stained his shirt, and Lyra knelt beside him, her hands trembling, yet she did not flee, and for the first time she turned her glowing power against her own people, sending a wave of light that struck them and forced them back, and her voice cried with defiance, "I am not yours anymore." The room shook with battle, and Ethan tried to stand, though his legs were weak, and he saw her fighting with everything inside her, not with hatred, but with something new, something born from the bond they had begun to build. And she was no longer only a warrior of her people, she was something else, something greater. And the hunters faltered, because they had never seen one of their own fight with such fire for a human, and for a bond that they could not understand. Ethan staggered to his feet and raised the rifle again, even though his arms shook, and Lyra stood beside him, glowing like a star in the dark, and together they pushed back against the hunters, though every strike left them weaker, and every breath felt heavier. And Ethan knew that the choice had been made. They would not surrender, they would not return, they would fight until the end, no matter how near it was. Lyra's voice rang through the chaos, clear and strong, as she cried to them, "You see fragility, but I see strength. You see weakness, but I see courage. And you may break our bodies, but you will never break this bond." And the hunters paused, as if struck by something deeper than her light, as if her defiance had pierced the armor of their pride. And for a moment, the storm slowed and silence fell, broken only by the hum of her glow. Ethan leaned against her, his strength failing but his spirit unbroken, and he whispered, "You have chosen Lyra." And she looked at him with tears and fire in her eyes and said, "Yes, I have chosen, and I will never go back." And in that moment, they stood not as two strangers from different worlds, but as something bound together by a choice that neither of them would regret, even if it cost them everything. The night roared again as the hunters prepared to strike once more, and Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle, and Lyra raised her glowing hands, and together they faced the storm, ready to give everything, because the bond between them was no longer a question, it was a truth carved in fire and fear and courage. And as the walls shook and the shadows closed in, they both knew that the next moments would decide whether they lived or died. But no matter the end, they would face it together. The walls of the outpost burned with fire, and the hunters pressed closer, their weapons cutting through the metal like paper. And Ethan stood weak and bleeding, his rifle almost useless in his shaking hands, but his eyes never left Lyra, because in that moment she was no longer only an alien girl begging for a bond. She was light itself, burning brighter than the flames around them, her body glowing like a star, and her voice carrying defiance that echoed through the broken halls. And Ethan felt pride rise in his chest, even as pain dragged him down, because he knew that she had made her choice, and her choice was him. The hunters circled like wolves, their voices filled with contempt, calling her traitor and calling him fragile, and promising that both would end before the night was over. But Lyra stepped forward and raised her hands, and the glow that poured from her body was no longer trembling, no longer uncertain. It was steady and fierce, and she cried to them, "I have chosen my bond, and it is not chains, and it is not fear, it is Not dominance, and it is not cruelty. It is trust, and it is sacrifice, and it is standing beside another even when the end comes. And if you call that weakness, then you do not know what strength is. The hunters roared in fury and stormed forward, their armored steps shaking the ground. But Lyra held her ground, and the light from her body spread like a shield, forcing them back. And Ethan, though wounded, pushed himself to his feet and stood beside her, his voice weak yet unbroken, as he shouted, "You will not take her, and you will not take this bond, because it belongs to us and not to you." And his words carried through the fire like iron, even though his body trembled. Battle raged fierce and desperate as the hunters struck again and again. And Lyra pushed them back with waves of light, each one stronger than the last, because every strike against Ethan only gave her more strength to rise, and every wound he carried became a wound she carried too, and in that sharing she finally understood the truth of bonding with a human. It was not about victory or survival, it was about carrying pain together and refusing to let go, even when the world demanded surrender. And she shouted, "This is what it means to bond. This is why I will never return to youth." Hunters faltered as if the fire in her words burned hotter than the light she cast. And for the first time, their steps slowed and their voices shook, and Ethan realized that her defiance had pierced the pride of her people, because they had never faced one of their own who chose weakness over power, and yet stood stronger than all of them combined. And in that moment, hope flickered inside him like a fragile flame that refused to die. The outpost cracked, and walls fell, and smoke filled the air, but Ethan and Lyra stood unbroken. And when the hunters struck one final time, Lyra gathered every piece of her strength and released it in a single wave of light, so bright that the desert itself seemed to glow like a second sun. And the hunters were thrown back, crashing against the rocks outside, their armor shattered and their voices silenced, and the storm of their rage scattered into the night, leaving only dust and silence behind. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his body too weak to hold him, and Lyra fell beside him, her glow fading but her eyes still burning with fire. And she reached out and took his hand and whispered, "Ethan, we are still here." And he looked at her through the haze of pain and smoke and smiled, because though he felt broken inside, he knew the bond between them had not broken, it had only begun. And he whispered back, "Yes, Lyra, we are still here, and we will not fall." The night grew quiet except for the crackle of fire and the distant echo of fleeing engines as the hunters retreated, defeated not by weapons or armies, but by the bond of two souls who refused to let go. And Ethan felt the weight of exhaustion pull at him, yet he also felt peace because he knew the battle was done. And Lyra leaned closer, voice soft and trembling with relief, and she said, "Ethan, I asked you to tell me how to bond with a human, and now I know, because bonding is not about winning or losing, it is about standing together, even when the sky falls, and even when the heart breaks." And I will never forget this truth. Ethan squeezed her hand, though his strength was almost gone, and he whispered, "Then you have learned more than I could ever teach." And Lyra smiled, though tears fell from her glowing eyes, and she said, "No, Ethan, you taught me with every breath, and with every wound, and with every moment you stood for me when no one else ever had. And now I understand why your kind survives, not because of your weapons or your strength, but because of your hearts." And she leaned her forehead against his, and for the first time, her glow felt warm and gentle, not fierce and desperate, but safe and alive. Dawn slowly crept over the desert, and the fires of the outpost dimmed, and the air grew calm. And Ethan sat with Lyra on the broken floor as the first light touched the horizon, and though the world around them was scarred, they felt a new beginning in their hearts, because the bond was real, and it was unbreakable, and it had been born in fire and in pain and in sacrifice. But it was theirs, and no one could take it away. Lyra looked at him, and her voice was steady now, free of trembling, as she said, "I will never return to them. I will walk with you wherever your path goes, and I will carry this bond not as a burden, but as my strength." And Ethan nodded, because he knew that whatever future waited, whether it was peace or war, Whether it was life or death, they would face it together, and that was enough. The wind carried away the last echo of the hunters, and the desert stretched endless before them. But inside that emptiness there was no fear, because they had each other, and as they stood side by side, broken yet unbroken, they both knew that this was the true beginning of their bond, and it would outlast the stars themselves. The end.